You've just landed inside LaunchStreet, the innovation podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate and differentiate and get further, faster in this crazy, cluttered world. And now, innovation thought leader and your Superfly host, Tamara Kleinberg.
What is up, LaunchStreet? Tamara here, your guide and super reluctant gluten-free eater. Darn you, gluten. Why? Yesterday, someone told me the saddest thing. They said that their boss told them, and I quote, "You need to be more creative. I'm not sure what it means, but I know you need more of it." Hello. How are you supposed to improve something when you don't even know what it means? When the person judging you on it doesn't even know what it means? How will you know if you're even successful? No clue. And that's why I invited Tina Seelig, a professor of the practice at Stanford University and author of the book, Creativity Rules, onto LaunchStreet. Get the wordplay there? So good. I think you're going to appreciate our conversation around, instead of going directly to solutions, taking time to reframe the problem. And her feeling that ideas are free, not cheap. Tina is an imaginative instinctual on our innovator archetype. So you'll hear how she's really tapped into that and how she frames things and how she engages in the world to find new dots to connect in different ways. Her archetype is fully unleashed. You can totally sense it. You'll even hear it when we get into a little bit of a debate about assessments and the one that she likes and the whole changing hats. That's the instinctual side, wanting choices, wanting circuitous paths. It's a really good conversation. There are a lot of great everyday creativity tools in this one. Enjoy.
Tina, thank you so much for coming by Inside LaunchStreet today. I'm excited for our conversation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, let's get to know you. What's one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
So there's so many things. I knew you were going to ask this. I was thinking, what should I tell folks? Well, one of the things I've been doing now that I've been having great fun with is I've been doing a lot of collage. And, I love to write. I write all the time, but there's something about doing art that exercises a really different part of your brain. And my medium these days is I use New Yorker covers. So I take New Yorker covers and I cut them up in interesting ways and put them back together. And I've been so surprised and delighted. It started as just an experiment and it's turned into a hobby.
Will you send me a picture? I have to see what one of these look like.
Oh, of course. I would be delighted. It's been great fun. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to share them with other people. And so I'm happy to share it with you.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. It's interesting timing that you say that. I was writing down a little note to myself about doing some art tonight. I'm holed up in our mountain house to write a book, my next book. And I've been thinking writing's not my main medium. And I've been writing for 4 days straight and I need a shift. So clearly hearing you talk about the art and the visual and how that exercises a different part of your brain made me realize, oh yeah, Tamara, just go get some magazines from the grocery store.
Exactly.
And do something different.
There's another thing that's interesting about doing art is that when you write a book and you give someone a book, you're actually asking them to make a pretty big commitment of time to read it and absorb it. But when you show someone a piece of art, they can absorb it all in one bite. And there's something fun about sharing something that can be immediately enjoyed without having to spend an enormous amount of time digesting it.
Don't you find too, and it's interesting that you're saying this because I just got off a call with a potential client, and after talking to them, I realized, wow, what you really need is some strategic visuals that everyone can align around.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there's something about words that I still have to interpret what you mean, yet there's something about, even though the definition's in the dictionary, right? Like it's, I guess, the same word for all of us, but there's something about what you're saying with visuals that you can get it instantly and actually get more alignment around.
In fact, it's one of the reasons in my last two books I've created these visual models because they make the content much more memorable, but also people can look at it in one second and say, oh, I get it. I see what you're trying to communicate. And then they dive into the text. So a model is a great way to bridge between having something graphic and something that's written with words.
So LaunchStreeters out there, I want you to, I know we're just kind of bantering around here before we've actually dug in, but I think what Tina's saying is so important. And the beauty of it is you don't have to be good or an artist. you just have to do it and have some fun with it and see what happens, which I think is really freeing to know that it's not about I'm creating a Picasso. It's about I'm visually representing what I'm thinking. That's all.
Exactly. And it's great fun too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because people come into the D school at Stanford where I teach, the Design Institute, and they instantly go, oh my gosh, I want to go to school here. Well, they aren't taking a class. They're not meeting a professor. They're not talking to students. They haven't seen a curriculum. The physical space invites you to be creative because it has all of these tools for doing rapid prototyping. Now, if you were in a kindergarten, it would be called it's like paper and markers and tape and scissors and Post-its and all sorts of other art supplies. But it's so freeing to be in a place that invites you to think that way.
Yeah, it's amazing the difference in how you feel when you walk into an office of cubicles versus walking to a space that invites you. Now, not to say that it has to be a Google or an Apple or even the D School, but just has put some thoughtfulness into creating a creative environment. It's just so different.
Well, one of the things that's most important about the space at the D School is not any of the fancy stuff. And in fact, there's very little fancy stuff. It's about the fact that it's all very flexible space. Everything moves. The tables move, the chairs move, the couches move, the prototyping bins move. And so you get to set the space. You get to design it like a theater set every time you go in to be used in different ways. And so the flexibility is also one of the most interesting pieces, not just the fact that the materials that are there.
Do you think part of unlocking your creativity is about getting out of routine and habit? And when I hear you talk about the space, part of me thinks, oh, the other cool part about that is it doesn't just put me into that same routine. I don't sit in my chair, look at the same thing, have the same perspective, open up my computer in the same way. I actually have the opportunity to shake things up immediately.
Absolutely. Now, of course, you can do that if you go on vacation, right? You get out of your comfort zone and you do something different. But absolutely, you can do it every single day. And we know this, right? If you take a different route to work, you go somewhere different for lunch, meet with someone you haven't met with before, it shakes things up. I mean, it starts really allowing you to connect and combine things in really interesting ways and certainly stimulates your creativity.
So what makes you so passionate about teaching creativity?
Oh my gosh. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I mean, I could have taken the route and stayed in academics as a scientist, but I got super excited about the fact that it really all comes down to creative problem solving. And no matter what field you're in, if you can't come up with really unique and interesting questions to ask and really fascinating and innovative solutions, you've missed huge opportunities. And so it was a way for me to pop up and look at these meta tools that are really relevant no matter what you're trying to do. I mean, if you're in politics, you need to be creative, right? A creative problem solver. If you're in, trying to cure cancer, you need the same type of tools. And so this is what I've been focused on. And it's remarkable. I just finished. This is the last week of the quarter. And I've gotten a lot of notes from students in my class this week saying they never thought of themselves as a creative person, but by given the tools that are really pretty straightforward to learn. It takes time to master, but to learn the basic tools for creative problem solving, it unlocks possibilities for everyone.
Do you think we've just, I don't know how to say this, untrained ourselves out of creativity? I mean, you look at, this is so cliche, but you look at kids and they're so creative in everything. I look at my 9-year-old and I just think, how did he even think of that? And then over time, it's like someone has to say to us, hey, you're still creative.
You know what? This is a huge issue, and clearly you and I are not the first people to say this.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, our school system is not tuned to stimulate creativity, and the reason is it's hard to measure, right? And so you have these school systems that are designed that they have a lot of pressure on them to have metrics for success. But one of my favorite quotes is, "Not all things that count can be counted, and not all things that can be counted count." And the point is that we need to be willing to focus on things that are not easy to measure. I mean, how do you measure love? How do you measure ethics? How do you measure creativity? These are things that are hard. And so we need to come up with some proxies that allow us to say, okay, we now know that someone is better at coming up with innovative ideas than before. But it's hard to do.
So was that a Dr. Seuss quote? I'm just kidding. I love that quote, but it feels like, what's that one of those who matter don't mind matter, whatever it is, but I love it. It seems like too that the only time we measure it is when there's an absence of it, when we go in the opposite direction, like bad ethics, status quo. It's almost harder for us to measure the positive, but we know when it's not there.
Well, one of the other issues, though, is that think about the way that we measure things, right? A typical multiple choice exam, which is easy to measure. But then you're given problems. And my favorite example of this is, what's the sum of 5 plus 5? Well, we all know the answer is 10, and there's one answer, and we've all memorized it. But there are ways to teach that concept by looking at it from a different angle. And you could say, what two numbers add up to 10? Well, in that case, there are an infinite number of solutions, and that's actually the way the real world works. Nobody tells you, listen, how often do you go to work and someone gives you a problem where there's one right answer? It never happens.
No,
never. It's like you're given problems like figure out how to sell more of these things, or figure out how to solve this problem, or figure out how to get to the moon. There's no right answer to that. And so we're giving people, it's a huge disservice to young people because we're giving them problems with one right answer. But when they get out into the real world, the problems they get have an infinite number of solutions. And so it really behooves us to prepare them for that type of problem solving.
What's I think interesting too about what you're saying with that 5 plus 5 equals 10 versus how do we get to 10 is I think in the real world, the thing we're trying to figure out is how do we get to 10? We've got an outcome, a goal, a milestone, something we need to accomplish, but how we get there is where that creativity, where there's so much room for it, but we get so focused on, but it has to be 5 plus 5.
Yes. And I want to build on that because you just said, right, your goal is to get to 10. Maybe your goal should actually be different. Maybe your goal should be to get to 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000. And so one of the things that I spend a tremendous amount of time doing is teaching my students how to reframe the problem, because oftentimes they're not even asking the right question. The question you ask is the frame into which the answers will fall. And so if you don't ask the right question, you're not going to create the space for coming up with the most interesting solutions.
So that's so fascinating to me. So let's dig into that. How do we reframe the problem? And I guess I'd back up and ask too, how do we know if we're not asking the right question? Is that a matter of just testing it? Should we be doing something? So will you walk us through kind of an example of that?
Yes. In fact, the way I give problems in my classes, I've been teaching for many years, and my teaching style has changed dramatically as I've realized where the real holes are. I used to give very well-constructive problems for the students to solve. How might we do this, blah, 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 blah. Now I give them one word. Oh. And the word might be sleep or death or memory or money. Right? These are examples of just a word. And the students have to framestorm. That means to essentially brainstorm about the questions that they want to ask around the space. So, we did money this last quarter, which was fascinating. And, so all of the teams had to essentially brainstorm around questions related to money. Oh. And they came up with an enormous range.
And there's so much baggage with money. Like, what a great word.
And it was great because it forced them to talk about something that was a little taboo. Death was even more so. That was fascinating. I did that last year. I was afraid that some students were going to drop the class. Like, nobody did. And absolutely, they felt it to be one of the most provocative projects they'd ever had, because it forced them again to talk about things that they didn't talk about. But then once you framestormed and have come up with all these different type of questions, you then can start brainstorming. So let me give you just a simple example to bring it home. Let's pretend that you and I run a suitcase company. Okay, and we make suitcases.
Okay.
We could interview people about what they like and don't like about their suitcase, and we could then design a new suitcase. We could make it lighter. We could make it more efficient. We could have it follow you around the airport, whatever you want to do. But we might not be asking the right question. Why do we use a suitcase? And it's actually a more subtle question than you think, because it takes people to often realize that actually a suitcase isn't even to help me take my things with me. The goal of a suitcase is to have the things I need at my destination, right? My goal isn't to carry things around an airport, right? My goal is to have the things I need at my destination. Well, that's a really different question. So once I've reframed the question as, how do I have the things I need at my destination? Now I can brainstorm around that. and come up with some really interesting solutions. And in fact, the people who do that might put the suitcase companies out of business, right? If they can solve that problem and I don't actually have to carry a suitcase.
I mean, sign me up right away.
Exactly. That's the point. And you can do this with anything. You could pick, an umbrella, right? Why do we use an umbrella? We could just keep redesigning umbrellas, or you could say, wow, the goal is to keep me dry in the rain.
This is so good. And what this reminds me of, I was just thinking in my head of some of the kind of business case studies I share in different ways, but it reminds me a little bit of Dollar Shave Club. Because I think while everybody was asking, how do I make a better shave? How do I get my customer a better shave? How do I get a better shave? He was asking a completely different question of how do I make it hassle-free? And because of that, he took hundreds of thousands of customers from the shelf light store that is like the sea of options and choices and, 15 blades and 8 blades and pivot heads and blah, blah, blah. But I love what you're saying. And I think that really is so powerful to say if we reframe it, we actually might come up with a whole different solution and probably one that's more forward thinking.
Exactly. Because if you don't do that, you're going to come up with incremental solutions, which, you know what? Maybe that's what you want to do. You want one more coffee shop or one more cover band. Okay. Or do you want to come up with something truly innovative? And in fact, this is critically important. I've been teaching a class called Creativity and Innovation for many years. And a couple of years ago, I kind of woke up and realized I was using those terms sort of interchangeably. And I decided that it would be so much more helpful to distinguish between the two. And so the definitions I use are creative ideas are new to you, but innovative ideas are new to the world. And by distinguishing between the two and having a shared vocabulary, in your class or your organization around this, you can say, great, okay, that was a super creative idea. Now let's push further, right? Let's push beyond the one that's new to you and come up with something that's truly innovative to the world.
Let's dig into that for a second. So in your book, Creativity Rules, which is a fantastic book, and we'll put the link in the show notes, you talk about the importance of a shared vocabulary, which is, I think, a little bit of what you're hinting at now, too, and some of the things that you're teaching in your class. Let's start there. So will you, first of all, give us a definition of imagination, creativity, and innovation. And I think you add entrepreneurship in there, too.
Exactly.
And why it matters to have that shared foundation.
Yes. So this is, I believe, so critically important. If I go into a room of people and I have everyone write down their definition of creativity or innovation or entrepreneurship, they're going to come up with a myriad of definitions. And you realize this is a huge problem, right? Because imagine in physics or biology or even sports, right? Or music, if we didn't have a shared vocabulary, we wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that we accomplish, right? There would be great arguments. We would, rockets would blow up, buildings would fall down.
It'd be anarchy.
Exactly. Well, it would be. I mean, if we all had a different definition of what gravity is
right.
Or what, acceleration is, and so, or even a home run in baseball, right? If we had different definitions, it would be a real problem.
We wouldn't be able to communicate at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet we tolerate this in the world of creativity and innovation. And so what I did is I put a stake in the ground and I came up with a vocabulary that I hoped would be really easy to remember, easy to learn, easy to communicate to others. So it's very simple. Imagination is envisioning things that don't exist, right? And we can probably all agree to that. But then creativity is applying your imagination to solve a problem, to address it could be even an opportunity. It doesn't have to be a problem. It could be like artwork is an opportunity. It's applying your ability to envision things that don't exist to address some sort of challenge. Innovation is then applying the creativity to come up with a unique solution. So it's pushing it further. And entrepreneurship is applying the innovation to scale it and bring it to the world. And I call this the invention cycle because the end leads back to the beginning. In order to be entrepreneurial, you need to inspire other people's imagination.
So let me ask this. If I'm in an organization, or maybe I lead an organization, where do I start? Where do I put my focus? How do I get this cycle moving?
Great question. So once I put together this framework that takes you through this process, I realized that then you could start looking at what actually has to happen at each of these steps to really bring this to life. And so I created a list of things that you have to do at each of these steps. And I squeezed it down into one representative action and one attitude for each step. Now, Why do you need an attitude and an action? It's actually because this is hard. And this is really hard. And if you don't have the right mindset, you're not going to be able to do it. So imagination requires engaging in the world and then envisioning what might be different. Now, most people think it's the other way around. They think that, oh, I envision what I want to do and then I engage in making it happen. But the first step is always engagement. It's engagement with the world, paying attention and seeing where the opportunities are. Most people walk around with blinders on, right? They don't actually see the possibilities in front of them. And so once do you want me to go through the whole cycle in this way?
And in fact, if you have a story or a case study to go with it, maybe that would help just kind of internalize what you're talking about. Because I think sometimes with this stuff, we nod our heads in theory like, okay, yeah. And then we walk away and go, well, how do I apply that?
Brilliant. Let me just go through it quickly and then I'll give an example.
Perfect.
So engage in the world and then envision what might be different. That's the imagination stage. Then you move on to the creativity stage. Now, here's the thing. You don't have to, right? We often walk by and go, wow, that building's falling apart. I could update it and make it, beautiful. But I don't necessarily do that to every building. I'm not going to go actually buy the building and fix it up. But if you actually have more motivation, you move to the creativity stage that requires motivation and experimentation, right? So a little motivation, you do a little experiment. Oh, that's interesting. I got some interesting results. So then you have a little bit more motivation and you do a bigger experiment. And so the creativity stage involves this series of increasing motivation and experimentation. And the point is, if at some point it doesn't work, you can give up, but you might move on to the next stage, which is the innovation stage, which requires focus and reframing. Now focus, now at this point you're going, all right, I'm all in. I'm going to really work on this full time. I'm going to put all my effort in.
I'm all there.
I'm all there. And I'm now going to start looking at the problem from really different angles. This is the reframing, right? Oh, yeah, suitcases. Maybe we're talking about the wrong problem here. Maybe we should be thinking about how do we get our belongings or have things we need at our destination. Okay. So that's a reframing. And then once you come up with some interesting solutions, you move on to the entrepreneurship stage, which requires persistence and inspiring others. And this is all the things my other colleagues teach: strategy, marketing, finance, organizational behavior, et cetera, but also the ability to tell a compelling story that gets other people engaged. So let me give you an example. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay. So the one I use in my book, which I think works really well, but I can give you dozens of them because I've talked to so many entrepreneurs who say, you know what, this is exactly the path I went through. But one that's really salient is Sal Khan Academy, right? He was having a nice life as, in finance, working in the world of business, making lots of money. And he, on the side, was helping his cousin with her math homework. So he was engaged, right? He was engaged with helping with her math, and then envisioned, wow, gosh, if she's having all these problems and I'm creating these little videos to help her with math, maybe I could help other people, right? So engage and then envision. So then he starts doing experiments. He starts putting all of these videos up on YouTube. And he's doing these experiments about what works, and his motivation is increasing as people are giving more and more and more responses, and he's getting all this feedback that this is helpful. And then he moves into the innovation stage where he quits his day job, says, I'm going to focus on this full time, and I'm going to start looking at this from a different angle. He builds his own website, creates an entire platform to teach, kids around the world and create these sort of online tutorials. And then he moves into the entrepreneurship stage where he now needs to scale it. He needs to raise money. He needs to hire people. He needs to inspire other people. And so this is a good example of how this works, starting with engaging in the world and then envisioning what might be different.
I love that story. He's such an inspiration. I've kind of forgotten about where he came from because it's gotten so big now. And in fact, I have a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old, both boys, and I use it all the time with them to help them with their math homework because frankly, it's far exceeded my ability as a parent.
Well,
so
I wish it had been around. Yes, I wish it had been around when my son was that age because honestly, he was eating up math and it would have been great for him to be able to use it to excel.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I think the part of what I appreciate about what you're saying is it's all those different steps, and it really is a series of experimentations to get to the large place. He didn't go from I have an idea to I have this platform that engages millions of people across the globe. It really was one step after another to kind of the point of your process.
Right. And at each step, you have to sort of set your new goal, right? We used to start with, right, what two numbers add up to 10, right? It's like, oh, my goal is 10. And then your goal becomes, oh, my goal is now 100. My goal is now 1,000,000.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right that it doesn't, you start out with something small. And in fact, this is one of the problems I've seen over the years. If you start out with an objective that is way too big, you're more likely to fail because there's no way to realize that instantly. And it's easy to get demoralized. So starting with a small goal to do some experiments and get some data allows you to keep building the foundation under which you can build something much bigger.
So this is going to sound like a tangent, but I think you'll probably go somewhere brilliant with it. So I want to share just a fitness story for a second and see how it relates to creativity. I'm not sure where the dots connect, but I feel like they do.
Okay.
So I've lost 35 pounds in this last year. And originally, I did what you said. I set this big goal. I'm going to lose 35 pounds or 40 pounds. And I could never get there, not even close to getting there, like maybe the first 5 pounds. And then I would just drop off and go back. And I was in this vicious cycle up front. Then instead of focusing on the goal, I said, okay, my goal is 6 days a week. I'm going to eat to my nutrition program and I'm going to go to the gym. And if I stick to that, I'll see what the results become. I'm not going to worry about if 35 pounds is even the right, nor 40 pounds, I think is what it was, is even the right number. I'm going to worry about, I shouldn't say worry. I'm going to focus on what I can do every single day in this realm, and then we'll see where it goes. And I'm just, as you were talking, I was thinking in a lot of ways, I think that's like creativity. And one of the points that you make in your book about not and I think you're saying with the 10 example too, is not setting yourself to one specific goal that's too big and maybe too specific. Maybe it is about all the little things you do to get there.
Well, I love this story for two reasons. One is the reframing, right? That the idea is instead of the goal being getting to, losing this amount of weight, the goal became you reframed it to, today I'm going to eat lots of vegetables, okay? And I'm going to go to the gym. And that reframing allowed you to do something that you couldn't do when you looked at it a different way. But you're bringing up something that's super important and something I've been thinking a lot about. I've been thinking about what makes people more successful than others. And I realize it's not the big things, it's the little things. And it's this idea that if you do 1% better each day, just 1%, you end up with an enormous compounding of that. So let me give you an example. If everyone just does their job, and if let's say your job is 1.0, I'm going to do my 1.0 and 1.0 and 1.0, and I'm just going to go in and do my job. Well, 1.0 to the 365, right? 1.0 times 1, 1, 1, 1 at the end of the year is what? It's 1.
Yeah.
You're at the same place. But if you take 1.01, so just 1% better each day, and you keep compounding that, at the end of the year, I believe it's 38.
Oh. I was like, don't make me do the math, Tina.
I think, no, but no, of course, you can pull out your calculator, but I think it's 38. And the idea is that going from just doing the same thing every day to doing 1% better, it's like one more push-up each day, right? Eat one more carrot, whatever it is that you want to do, okay? And that by the end of the year, you've accomplished so much more. And people often don't see that 1%. And so they look at someone who's been really successful and they think it's just luck.
Yeah. Or one big leap, right? Like one big chasm that they got over or something.
Exactly.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the 1%. And I'm if you could see me, I'm smiling because that's actually one of our daily mottos at LaunchStreet is 1%. So every time I send an email, every time I make a decision, whatever we're doing, every time I do a video, every time I do a podcast, when I prepare for the questions, we always ask ourselves, what's that 1% extra we could do right now to make it that much better? And I think you're right. I think over time, the compounding value is so great.
Yes. And if you did 1% worse,
right.
At the end of the year, you've lost so much ground, right? So that mindset of looking at opportunities and sort of engaging in the world and seeing what could be different not only helps with creative problem solving, but also helps with your career. In fact, one of my most important lessons I teach my students is that I think is important is that when you get a job, you don't get that job. You're getting the keys to the building.
Wow.
And when you walk into any situation, there are so many opportunities there that are invisible initially, but you start observing and seeing places you can really contribute, and you can move at a great pace if you can just start not viewing your job as just the thing that was written on the job description when
the
you
bullet points.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really important that you mention that for those launch treaters out there listening. I think that the thing that I'm hearing among business leaders across the board is that job description is becoming irrelevant. It's not about what they hired you to do. It's about, like you said, what you can contribute. And today's business has to be so agile and so adaptive that to go in and say, well, this is my job, is putting yourself out of business.
Yes, exactly. Well, you've let everyone know that you have reached the level of your aspirations and your competence, right? If you just do your job, you're letting everyone know, oh, well, that's the job they do. But if you push further, you're letting people know that your aspirations are much higher.
And I think that really allows you to engage creative problem solving too, don't you think? Because now you're looking at problems and opportunities and saying, what can I do with that versus here's my task I need to get done today.
Exactly.
So I have to just really quickly take a side tangent and talk about your innovator archetype because I'm listening to you. It's just so fascinating. And then I want to get back into some other questions for you. So you took our innovation assessment, the IQE, which I think to no surprise, you probably understand we built it because we wanted everybody to recognize how they innovate and that we all do things a little bit differently and that it's not just for, Susie down the hall with the blue streak in her hair and the funky Pumas who knows all the cool cafes, that really we all have an ability to contribute. But what I find fascinating about yours is, so your power triggers are imaginative and instinctual. That's how you innovate. And I was listening to you, and the imaginative side is all about novel ideas, things from scratch. And I think in your ability to come up with this reframing, because that's coming up with a completely different way to look at something that doesn't yet exist. And that 1% going further, all of that is that imaginative side, kind of that creating in the gaps. And then on the instinctual side, your whole kind of engage with the world, connect the dots. So people who are instinctual are really good at connecting the dots in new and meaningful ways. So while the rest of us go A to B to C to D, someone like you, Tina, is really good at, A to L to X. And oh my gosh, here's how it all comes together in a different way. And it's so cool to hear that from you. I'm just curious from your perspective, and especially because you're steeped in this world too, how being imaginative and being instinctual has helped you not just be creative, but also teach it to others.
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, this is who I am. It's what I've done. If you ask my mom when I was a kid, every day I'd say, hey, I've got an idea. I've got an idea. So that's sort of my mantra is I've got an idea. But one of the things I want to point out is that we all can stretch in this direction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just like, you were talking about doing more exercise, right? It's not as though you said, oh, I'm not an athlete. Well, maybe you're not going to, enter the Olympics, but every single day you can get better. And I deeply believe that all of us can. I loved your test that I did and the evaluation. One of the ones I use in my class that's very simple is De Bono's 6 hats. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yeah.
And I love it because hats are different than some of these other tests because guess what? You can take a hat off and you can change your hat. And so the hat color is very simply, for those who aren't familiar, is the green hat is the hat for people who lead with creativity. The red hat is those people who lead with intuition. The blue hat is the people who like processes, sort of like organization processes. The white hat is facts. You kind of want all the details and the facts. The black hat is a devil's advocate. They look at what might not work. And the yellow hat is the sort of optimist who's always looking at how to make things work. And the thing I do in my class is I give the students an exercise to do. And through the course of the exercise, they have to change hat color. And I go through a process where they all have the same hat color on at the same time. And they've found that to be incredibly useful. So during your brainstorming, you go, okay, let's all put on the green hat. But then when you're going to evaluate the ideas, you say, oh, now we have to put on our black hats and see where the potholes are. So, and if you really understand that there are these different types of styles, but even though you have your dominant style, that you can actually stretch into using the others, I find that very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, the whole reason we built the assessment wasn't to say this is the only way you are. It's a layer, it's a dimension, but it's also to say, hey, here's a starting point. We can all contribute. And I think the hats do a similar thing too of, hey, here's the way that you can contribute. And I think it's so important for people out there and listening to this podcast too, because Tina, I think you've said it over and over again, to recognize that creativity, innovation, that whole cycle you talked about is something that we actually all have a piece of and have a ability to contribute in versus saying, well, this is I'm the analytic, I'm not the creative, but so-and-so over there is. And I think in companies, oftentimes we make the mistake of siloing it and saying, here are the 6 cool people who play in the disruptive innovation space, and then here's the rest of us, which is almost an indicator of saying like, so those 6 people get to play, but the rest of us just do our jobs. And if we're lucky, they give us something,
I agree with you completely. In fact, I think I am a little bit allergic to those people who have black hats who are always trying to figure out what won't work.
Yeah.
But once I know that someone is a black hat, it actually makes me much more relaxed. I realize that when they're saying things that sound critical, that's actually the way they think about what might not work. And I really appreciate it because I know that there are many times in the process, because I'm not a black hat, I need those people on the team who are going to help me see around corners and see where the weak parts of an idea are. And so you're absolutely right. We need to understand where we're all coming from and our dominant working style. And I love these tests not because one is better than the other, but because it gets the conversation going.
Totally agree.
We can have a discussion about, this is the way you approach problems. This is the way I approach problems. This is what I'm good at. This is where my weaknesses are. And you can then put together a team that really complements each other.
I just want to take a pause and just highlight for a second your point about the yes butters, as we like to call them, because I think for LaunchStreeters out there, this is so important. I think sometimes in innovation or in creativity, we buy into this myth that we should surround ourselves by the yes-anders, and the yes butters just don't get it. They're not visionaries, they're not creative, they're going to drag us down. But I totally agree with you. I think they are brilliant at helping us understand the holes that we don't see. We cannot see the whole thing at once. And I think this avoidance of them is actually a huge mistake. The big question is, how do we engage them? That's a whole different podcast. In fact, I have a whole one on language of innovation, which I will do later. But I'm glad you mentioned that because I do think it's important that we get over this myth of, those people just don't get it.
And the thing that's important is to know when in the process you engage that type of thinking. Because if you engage that type of thinking early on, it can be destructive. But if you bring it in later, it's incredibly helpful. Exactly. And so it's understanding what the different roles are and making sure you have them engaged at the right time.
So I'm wondering, with all of this conversation and the processes, and I love how you've kind of mapped out the whole virtuous cycle of it really, where do you think is the hardest part for the students, for the kind of people in the business world? Is it the coming up with the ideas, or is it the implementation?
Oh gosh.
Or is it all of the above?
This is such a loaded question. People always love to say ideas are cheap, and I hate that. A great idea is incredibly valuable. I always say, ideas are not cheap, they're free. And, just like oxygen, right? Oxygen is in the air, it's free, but if we didn't have it, we would die. So it's not cheap, it's valuable. And so I think that we need to get away from thinking that ideas are cheap. Yes, you can generate a lot of ideas. Some people do it really better than others, and you can learn to be better. And then, of course, there's the implementation. And the reason that people think that implementation is harder is because it usually takes more time. But the thing to keep in mind is that the creativity is woven through the entire process, because as you're trying to implement something, you're going to keep hitting problems, right? And
in fact, that's where you'll hit a lot of them.
Is where you need even more creative problem solving. So it's not as though this is critically important. It's not that the creativity happens just at the beginning and then, okay, now we're just going to go like a fire and forget missile and just deliver. No, now the creativity has to be woven through the entire process in order to get to successful conclusion.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that innovation happens or in creative problem solving happens throughout it. And sometimes we forget that, hey, that front end is only part of the process. The process is much longer. It's more of a marathon than it is a sprint.
Exactly.
Do you think, though, that sometimes I wonder because, in the ideation phase, everything's possible, right? I think it's the green hat, right? So we put on that hat and we come up with all the possibilities. It's okay that only one or two of those possibilities move forward. I think sometimes we look at the quantity and we go, well, we didn't really do a lot with that. But that's because really, in reality, only a couple of them should have gone through the entire process.
Right. And the thing is, you can always go back to the drawing board, right? If you pick one or two of the ideas to test and implement and they don't work out, you now have a whole set. I require my students, when they do this whole process where I give them a word and they have to framestorm to come up with lots of different questions, and then they pick a few of them to take further, they have to come up with, for each question, at least 100 solutions.
Yeah, that's great.
And they at first balk at that. They're like, what are you talking about? Like 100 solutions? And then they realize, very quickly, the first solutions are very incremental and expected.
Yeah, they're the obvious ones.
Exactly. And then when you get further down, it's where you start coming up with the interesting things. And so, in fact, many of the teams that are in the classes I teach realize that the ideas they end up implementing are, number 97 out of 100. It was like, oh, that's when we came up with something truly interesting.
We do this exercise called throw ideas away, where we literally it's one idea per sticky note, and then they have to throw it on a desktop trash can.
Uh-huh.
And there's something so powerful about going, okay, here's the idea, and I can't use it, so I got to come up with a new one.
Uh-huh.
Until you get to the 100, and I love that you do that because I think you're so right. And for those LaunchStreeters out there listening, know that sometimes you just need to take a deep breath and keep going before you're going to get to the one that actually is maybe the more innovative or the one that's actually going to solve the problem. It's probably not in the first two thoughts.
Right. But there are some tools you can use to help you get further. I'm a big fan of coming up with lots of small prompts that allow you to open up the door to new ideas. Like, okay, how would we solve the problem if we had no money?
Yeah.
How would we solve the problem if we had $1 million? How would we solve the problem 50 years ago? How would we solve it 50 years in the future? What if we were solving it for a 5-year-old? What if we were solving it for a 95-year-old, right? Each of these opens the door to new solutions. And so if you come up with all these different types of mini prompts, it makes it much easier to get to 100.
I love it. I love how would I solve this if I were my alter ego? I've tried that one before, and it comes up with fascinating stuff. But I think the bigger point that you're making is something that we should really be listening to, which is come up with a lot of little prompts. Like get yourself there in a lot of different ways. Pull that Play-Doh apart in different ways, and you'll come up with different solutions naturally.
Exactly. So
before we close out, where can people go to connect with you and learn more?
Great. I am on Twitter at Seelig, so TSEELIG, and always happy to engage with people there. I have a website, tinaseelig.com. I'm happy to have visitors. And my books are all available wherever books are sold.
Awesome. And we'll put all of that in the show notes. I wish we had another hour, but I will end with a question of what's one thing LaunchStreeters can do right now to unlock more creativity in themselves?
Well, go back to engaging. Do something different. Really pay attention. Even sit in some place that you normally go. It could be a cafe or your own kitchen table, and just spend an hour observing, paying attention, writing down your observations, and seeing what interesting opportunities unfold.
I love it. Tina, thank you so much. I feel like I have 10 other questions for you, so we'll have to have you back. Hopefully you'll have another book come out. We can have another reason to have you on, but it's been so good. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now that you've listened, are you ready to framestorm or what? I know I am. Part of the thing with creativity or being innovative, as we focus on here at LaunchStreet, is knowing your natural innovative strengths. As I mentioned in the opener about the LaunchStreeter that's boss told them to be, quote unquote, more creative, they didn't know where to start. What do you do first? Good news. I can totally help you with that. The first step is being empowered. And the way you do that is by understanding how you naturally innovate so that you can do more of what works for you. Be innovative on demand. It's super easy when you are playing to your strengths. So here's what I want you to do. Go to our website, go to LaunchStreet.com, GOTO LaunchStreet.com, link is in the show notes, and click on assessment for yourself or even for your team. It is the best place to start because at the end of the day, innovation starts with you. Tamara out.
Thanks for hanging out with us inside LaunchStreet. When you're ready to take your game to the next level, join the thousands of others that are upping their innovation edge on GoToLaunchStreet.com, the top online education resource and community platform for innovators looking to use innovation to get measurable results. Go to LaunchStreet.com.